Back to the Center for the Ecology of Infectious Diseases. This is time for the panel discussion. The panel discussion will be led by Dr. John Drake, who we heard from earlier. And then additionally, the panelists are Mike Neafsey, who we just heard from as well. And the two other panelists and speakers who you have not met thus far are Susan Hills and Dr. Susan Hills and Dr. Paul Sundberg. Dr. Susan Hills, MBBS, MTH, is a medical epidemiologist in the Division of Vector-Borne Diseases at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Fort Collins, Colorado. She has worked as a public health physician for more than 25 years with a particular focus on arboreal diseases. Susan's interest in Japanese encephalitis began in 1998 when she had the opportunity to investigate the first case of JE on the Australian mainland. Later, she worked for many years on a project on global control of JE with the non-government organization PATH in Seattle. She has spent the last 13 years working at CDC, where she led the work group developing JE vaccine recommendations for U.S. travelers and has been investigating the impact on JEV vaccination in Asia. Dr. Paul Sundberg, who is the executive director of the Swine Health Information Center. Dr. Paul Sundberg is the Swine Health Information Center's executive director. The mission of the Swine Health Information Center is to protect and enhance the health of the United States swine herd through coordinated global disease monitoring, targeted research investments that minimize the impact of future disease threats, and analysis of swine health data. Dr. Sundberg is responsible for implementing the center's missions and objectives. And with that, John, I turn the panel over to you.
Great. So thank you all for participating in this. I think this is going to be great. We want this to be a conversation between our folks online and our folks here, as well as you all as certainly experts in this area. But why don't I launch with a question that nobody knows the answer to, so I just want to know what your gut says. And this is, if we have a JEV introduction into the US and we detect it, where are we, like what population are we going to get? I see a couple of options that have been listed already. That might be in birds, perhaps because of die-offs, because of monitoring. It might be in domestic pigs farming operations. Of course, they're far from presumed points of introduction. It might be in wild pigs. It might be in mosquitoes because of surveillance. There's something nobody has said, but I wonder about. Could it be in backyard pigs, more geographically dispersed than farmed pigs, likely to seek veterinary care, but of course, not nearly as many of them. What is your gut say?
Any of us?
All three of you. I'd like to know if you have the same answer.
I don't agree or come this way. Given our discussions today with our Australian colleagues, given the network of laboratories that we have and the work that we've done with the swine industry, in my opinion, it'd be very likely that we'd see this in our swine populations first. We detect it in our swine populations first. Whether that is the first population to truly be infected, that's another conversation. But I think the likelihood of detection.
So we might find it in Iowa and North Carolina, but it's like a sleeper epidemic for a little while before we pick it up.
I hope.
Paul?
Well, I agree with that, unless it follows a type of pattern that West Nile did with having some sort of unexplained die-off in birds. Now, we didn't hear that from Australia, but there's got to be some sort of a trigger that causes investigation in order to be able to find it in the species. So an unexplained die-off in birds might be one, but my expectation would be that with the diagnostic lab systems that we have for veterinary medicine now, and the interest in production, that the domestic pigs would be the first one we find it in. I agree with you, probably subclinical or undetected infection circulating first, but detected first in our pigs because of the diagnostic systems we have.
Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say pigs as well, and being a human health doctor rather than an animal health doctor, I don't want to say too much more about pigs. What I would say is that I think it's highly unlikely that humans will be the ones that we detected in. I do think it will be in pigs or birds if they did happen to be any sort of impact on birds. The reason I don't think we're going to detect it in humans is that It looks exactly like our other domestic arboviruses in terms of the brain infection, the symptoms, and then the main means of diagnosis is serological, and you've got the serologic cross-reactivity. So almost inevitably, somebody would test for West Nile or syphilis encephalitis. It will come up positive because there is cross-reactivity within that flavivirus group, and nobody's going to take it the next step of thinking maybe this is JE, maybe we should do plaque reduction neutralization test for confirmation. And this is particularly because there's not going to be clusters of human cases. 1 in 100 infections is actually symptomatic. So you're not going to see suddenly a group of humans get infected, they're going to be dispersed. So I do think there will be some sort of event, most likely with pigs, where it would be detected.
So Susan, actually, I kind of had a follow-up question for you related to that. One of the things that I heard earlier was that they did, in fact, retrospectively identify in Australia an increase in the number of probable encephalitis cases that were probably due to infection with JEV. And of course, I mean, my understanding is probably half of human encephalitis is not actually diagnosed with the etiological agent. Do we have any reporting system that if we had a cluster of unidentified origin encephalitis in the US, we would pick it up in some statistical sense?
So there is a couple of places around the country that do have ongoing cohorts of human cases where they do extensive testing on unexplained encephalitis and metagenomics and things like that. There is not specifically, as far as I'm aware, any JE testing as part of that. It's more a comprehensive panel of potential pathogens, but JE is so low down on the likelihood that it's not included in that. We have considered and we have developed a human health plan, and we have considered that some sort of retrospective testing might be something that is worthwhile just to see if we've ever had any evidence, but we have sort of felt that it's probably like looking for a needle in a haystack, and therefore whether it's worth the time and resources is pretty questionable.
Okay, thanks. Is there a question in the room?
Not a question, but can I just make a comment in regards to your specific point about backyard hogs? Jane Marie Hannibal, I'm the state veterinarian here in Georgia, so I'm the state animal health official that he was referring to. So I think one thing to consider is kind of that sleeper potential component with our backyard hogs, because our commercial hogs have a lot of eyes on them. We're much more likely, because we're tracking, we're recording, to notice something like an uptick in stillbirths and mummified fetuses and things such as that. But our backyard operations are far less structured than that. We certainly have responded to things like swine brucellosis, where the producer does not know, for example, how many pigs they have. They've got quite a large property. They've got commingling with feral hogs. You kind of end up with these sort of transitional hogs that are somewhere between feral and domesticated. So I think for a state like Georgia, that's something that would really concern me, is that we would have kind of a delayed response if the initial introduction was into backyard hogs, because we're much less likely to get that call immediately versus one of our commercial producers who would know, call my vet, call the state vet's office, and to kind of trigger that response much more quickly.
Thank you. Any comments from the panel?
No doubt. Yeah.
Feral swine would further complicate that. We could have, we're not out looking for mummified fetuses of feral swine. So that would be, again, further complicate the issue. It could circulate in a particular population in the South, or it would ultimately jump into the backyard or the commercial.
The issue is some sort of a trigger that would, something that would trigger an investigation. The assumption is with those backyard folks that something's got to happen at a higher level that would trigger an investigation with those. That's an assumption, and that's not always the case. But that trigger is more likely to happen with those populations that we're closely monitoring. And that's, I think that's the assumption that we're making.
But I think we have a great opportunity now trying to kind of get ahead of this with the great feedback we got from Australia this morning and things like that through extension agents and other mechanisms that are more in contact on a day-to-day basis with our backyard producers. those are the kind of avenues we need to start making sure they've heard this term JEV, they're kind of, because they're a great resource for reporting.
So of course, public outreach and education then is a big part of any response, and of course, proactive response. Is this a jumping off point to ask you, who are the people that we need to be communicating to, and what are the messages? Sounds like backyard hog owners might be one such population.
So sure, you just use the term public outreach and education. It's not only public outreach and education, but there's also a lot of technical outreach and education that has to happen in order to enhance our opportunity to find this. We were just talking at the break about the American Association of Veterinary Diagnostic Labs. And the diagnosticians in the veterinary diagnostic labs see abortions and mummified fetuses regularly without a diagnosis. And one of the challenges is to ensure that they have JEV as a differential in their mind to test for that. Also, our practicing veterinarians, the same type of thing. The videos of shaker pigs that we saw from Australia, that's not an uncommon thing out on the farm. And that's certainly not pathognomonic. So those types of investigations have to happen as well.
John King, Center for the Ecology of Infectious Diseases, related to the conversation about backyard swine populations, if you will, as Jamboree just suggested. Going back to Natalia's model, would it make sense to even have some type of sentinel hog population at some of the airports that we are concerned with, so like San Francisco International or Chicago O'Hare or Newark Liberty, which have international flights such that we were to keep some type of small hog population that in turn could be checked over a period of time to understand if an infected mosquito came into these airports, that perhaps these would be the signals that in turn would let us know that JEV is here, or for that matter, even Miami International, which has an extraordinary presence in South America. Any thoughts on that?
I see value in that. I know that the resources that we need to go into supporting such an endeavor would be tremendous. Putting swine in downtown Chicago would be difficult on a good day. That would definitely be something that we'd have to get direction from leadership on. If the risk is high enough, and if the return on investments for that particular initiative was high enough. There are a lot of things that we need to weigh before jumping into that particular endeavor. However, I mean, sentinels have been used across the globe for many different reasons. So obviously there is value for that type of interaction.
Thank you.
What about just capitalizing on existing populations by setting up a sentinel system?
One of the things that we've learned, I think a lesson learned from all of the African swine fever planning that's gone on since 2018 is the analysis of surveillance streams and the efficiency of different surveillance streams to be able to detect either the first infection or to use them to show negative status for the country. And while sentinel pigs in any spot may be a surveillance tool, a surveillance stream that could be used, I think that the first step needs to be the good folks probably at CEID in Fort Collins have to do an analysis of the risks and the benefits of different surveillance streams so we can focus on those that will give us the most return for the investment that we're making into it.
Yeah, I would add to that because we've got to think about human health, because as soon as you put pigs out there, they're the amplifying host, and you just leave the mosquitoes who are bitten them and they're viremic for 5 days and you suddenly establish an outbreak, which is not the best approach. But there is other sentinels. There was a paper from Japan that suggested that dogs got infected and did not have high level viremia. So you could look at potentially other animals, but I would be fairly cautious about using pigs anywhere. When we did, after the 1998 case in Australia, put sentinel pigs around at several locations around the tip of Cape York, and they were fantastic. We bled them every 2 weeks, and show when there was further importations of JEV, but we were able to do that because it was completely isolated areas. And when we went and put the sentinel pigs out, I went up and vaccinated the families that were going to be looking after those pigs, and there was nobody else for long, that's 5-10 kilometres from where they were placed. So you need to think about those pieces.
So many, as David Reed's consulting veterinarian, if I look at most of the, not all by any stretch, but very large number of the commercial pig operations we have in the U.S. are at least curtain-sided barn, and some are solid-sided barns. I think the potential for mosquitoes coming in contact with the pigs within those barns is probably, well, I'll just say probably, it is much lower than it would be with outdoor pigs. And so the outdoor pigs, if you're looking for sentinel farms, it's those farms rather than the ones that are indoors. I noticed on the Australian slides that they were indoors, but they were not, there was no barrier between the outside and the pigs that were inside. And so I can see how the mosquitoes get into those kinds of barns very easily. But I would say that those outdoor pigs, and I think we probably go back and look at the literature. We even had a case here in the state of Georgia, Eastern encephalitis, that occurred in an outdoor pig farm. It's been several years ago now, but it killed most of the newborn pigs on the farm. And so I think it's going to be in those outdoor pigs is where the surveillance would need to be more than would be barns that have a barrier.
Australia did point out at least one of their farms were the tunnel style, fully ventilated, fully enclosed, that they had some incursion on that farm. But they also had, I believe they had identified that, I apologize if I'm wrong on this. It's been a long morning, a lot of information. But I seem to remember they had talked about slatted floors with some water underneath of it. So there was some opportunity for mosquitoes to come from underneath. I could be incorrect on that though.
And you will find that in a lot of pig farms in the U.S. That situation with the underslat slurry storage.
Yes. And that's why I brought that up.
Yes.
It's just that seemed like a very similar operational style.
And experience, David, the counter to that is that for the years when I was with the pork board, practically every fall we get communication of some sort from a packer or packers that said there's such an increase in biting fly and mosquito lesions in the hides. You've got to do something about telling people to control these insects. So I don't know if that's an indication that it's more or less than outside, but it certainly is an issue.
Please.
Abby Cannon, American Association of Swine Veterinarians. In talking about vectors and mosquitoes, the competent vectors that we have in the United States, is anybody on the panel or anybody in the room know what their preferred feeding patterns are? Indoors, outdoors, day, night?
They're mainly, so most of the cullets that are here, that are ornithophilic, so, but if they don't find those particular hosts, they will feed on whatever is available. And usually they are more active in sunset, and but again, that depends on those. I shouldn't be talking, I'm not an entomologist, but that's based on the literature. That is the type of behavior the Culex species present in the US.
So if it was the same vectors as West Nile virus, which we suppose it would be, Quinkler fasciatus, tarsalis, amphibians, all feed basically from dusk to dawn and predominantly outside.
Please go ahead.
Hey, this is Steve Rankin from USDA BS1 Health. One of the things that struck me about the Australian presentation this morning was how well received the food safety messaging was. And I know each of us had different roles to play. I think I'm kind of just one focus to think about. Obviously, that's further down the road. That would be JE is entered and previously established, and we have to talk about the product element, but I just hear what folks think about kind of how receptive the public is to messages like this and what we can kind of do ahead of time to prepare those messages if we need to.
The question of how receptive they are is, I'm not sure that's answerable, not in today's environment. But there is, on behalf of the Pork Board and National Pork Producers Council, a lot of planning for consumer messaging around a variety of different diseases. Foot and mouth disease, for example, has a cross-species working group, a communications working group, specifically been talking about that for a couple of decades. And there's a lot of preparation that happens with that, and planning for that specifically. But receptivity, I think, is something that we just don't know.
You know, it's nice that there's some kind of off-the-shelf or such products that could be just fine to replace FMD with JEV and should be ready to stand up.
So I think we have a remote question.
Yes, we have a question from virtual attendee Jennifer SHIC. What's the most important take-home message for U.S. pork producers regarding JEV? And what do producers need to do to be prepared?
So the take-home message, I think, is, as it is with a lot of other transboundary and even endemic diseases, take-home message is vigilance, is don't ignore an animal, a health event on your farm, and assume that it is the same thing that Doc found last time. Don't ever do that. Always get that professional diagnostic help, and question the professional diagnostic help that you get, the answers you get. Question your veterinarian and ask them the likelihood of the success of that diagnosis from the veterinary diagnostic lab. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that we can do as producers. There's all kinds of things with biosecurity, et cetera, that always apply. And biosecurity is a 24/7 issue, and it's very difficult. But biosecurity in this setting is a little different than the biosecurity that we've had before because of the vector transmission. So that's another step of biosecurity, another issue. I think the most important message for producers is that issue of don't make assumptions and just sit on your assumptions and wait until something else happens, find out what's going on.
Beyond that, can I just expand just a
Sure.
little bit? So I think, building networks early and improving communication at the local and regional levels, whether you're talking within your particular swine network or, you're talking to your neighbors, you're talking to local associations, you're talking to your state animal health officials, whomever it may be, you have some outlet to share, these issues. Develop a network, lean on that network to share ideas, share what things are working, what things are not. I'm having this happen. That way, you don't fall into, well, this is the same old thing, because one neighbor could say, I'm having these death losses, and they just sit by themselves in a vacuum and have these death losses that their neighbor could be experiencing, or somebody within their network could be experiencing the exact same thing. And having those networks pre-built and, well practiced, well established, to where we're sitting down and talking about, okay, we now have multiple farms here that are having the same issue and continue to not get this answer. It's again going to prompt the question the diagnostics, question the veterinarian, what's going on? We haven't found an answer. Have we tested this? Finding those networks to push a little bit further there. I think communication around these issues is, it may not be the first thing, as pointed out, but I think it's a critical piece to this.
So something that I heard this morning from Dr. SHIC was that the human health risk is actually what drives the response. But here we are talking mostly about livestock and wild animals, because of course we understand that's where the amplification programs, let's see, pathways of introduction and so forth. How do we better connect these two things? Maybe that's a question of what's the role of the One Health paradigm in thinking about combating JEV or other emerging transboundary infectious diseases. And maybe I can start with Susan on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical. I think One Health is becoming, there's an increasing awareness about the importance of One Health and those issues. I mean, this meeting in itself was fortuitous because we've had a plan for quite some time that we have been intending to share more widely with USDA and other partners, but haven't taken those next steps. So, you know, we certainly acknowledge that, and particularly for a disease like this, those relationships. And you know, I think they were talking about this morning in Australia about having to set up a data sharing agreement. But I think predominantly we already have those relationships between, you know, federal partners, federal and state partners, you know, pretty much set up. There's always a room for improvement, but I think it is going to be critical.
And how about with private and academic partners? And that's a question for anybody. It seems to me a lot of the information is going to come from producers.
So it's a question about communication and about collaboration and the willingness to work together. The term we always use in the industry is state federal industry partnerships. And one of the things that we offered through the United States Animal Health Association, USAHA, is a resolution for USDA to respond to that asks for a review and revision to the response strategy that Mike referenced. And part of that resolution included working with the industry, working with USDA, working with the industry and stakeholders, which we didn't specifically say CDC or public health, but stakeholders, so we could get that sphere to all sit down together and figure this out. That's the way that we're going to be able to form the plan and to do our best that we can, first in prevention, but secondly, if that's not successful, then in preparedness.
So we're almost out of time for this session. So why don't I ask one last question again of each panelist? And the question is this: what is the single most important next step for JEV preparedness in North America?
Take that one.
Okay.
Continue conversation.
Continue conversation.
We can't walk away from this particular conversation. You know, I've talked to a couple folks in the audience where we learn this much, we take home this much. You know, after 6 months, this much becomes this much. So we need to, you know, build some momentum here, have conversations, again, re-engage, sit at the table with partners, and continuing conversation.
So mechanism to ensure that the conversation continues. Paul?
Urgency. Conversation's good, but if the conversation happens 6 months from now, we don't know if this Friday at 5 p.m., which is really, if it's going to happen, it's probably likely this Friday at 5 p.m. that we'll have the first introduction of JEV. So in order for us to be best prepared, we have to have a sense of urgency and get things done.
Thanks. And Susan?
And I would say just keeping JEE on the table. You know, I've been aware of this Kansas State Uni's work for quite some time, but really not aware of much else going on. And so it's exciting with the opportunity of what's happened in Australia to have brought it to the forefront and having people talk about it. But there's always a risk. And, you know, at CDC, you know, we've been dealing with one outbreak after another: chikungunya, Zika, COVID, monkeypox, now Ebola. And, you know, literally as you pass on, everything gets put on the table and gets put behind. So I'm hoping that there will be sort of a maintenance of momentum, that we won't move on to the next event that happens on Friday that's not JE.
Can we add to that?
Sure. Go ahead, David.
I would say awareness through greater communication. And the other one that I would say is surveillance. And I think surveillance, whether it's through wildlife or how we're going to do this, so the natal lab system, whatever it's going to be, but we need to step up our surveillance if we think it's as imminent a risk as what we seem to be saying and devoting our time to here today. So awareness through communication and greater surveillance.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Join me in thanking our panelists for